Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back in time. Not to the roar of cannon fire or the clash of steel, but to a far more insidious and, frankly, utterly disgusting enemy that stalked armies throughout history. Dysentery. Imagine, for a moment, you're a soldier in a sprawling encampment. The air is thick with the smell of wood smoke, damp earth, and something else. Something foul. You've been marching for days, living off hardtack and whatever water you can find. You feel a strange cramping in your gut, a growing urgency. This isn't just a stomachache. This is the first whisper of a terrifying, debilitating illness that claimed more lives than any musket ball or bayonet. It's a reality so brutal, so utterly unglamorous. You probably wouldn't have survived it. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're a soldier, part of a vast, formidable army, seemingly invincible against any human foe. But then it begins. A single soldier, then two, then a dozen, are struck down not by enemy fire, but by an internal rebellion. You start to feel the cramps, sharp and sudden, twisting your insides. Then comes the uncontrollable urge, the desperate dash to relieve yourself, only to find that what emerges is not merely waste, but a watery, often bloody, discharge. This is dysentery, and its onset in an army camp is like a silent, horrifying explosion. Imagine the confusion and terror. One day, your comrade is standing tall, laughing around the campfire. The next, he's doubled over, pale and sweating, unable to leave his blanket. The symptoms are unmistakable and utterly debilitating severe diarrhea, often with blood and mucus, intense abdominal pain, fever, and a relentless, exhausting dehydration. You watch as men, once robust and strong, waste away with terrifying speed, their eyes sunken, their bodies mere shadows of their former selves. The initial outbreak in an army camp isn't like a battle with clear lines. It's an invisible enemy, spreading with chilling efficiency through the ranks. One man uses a contaminated latrine, then touches a communal water bucket. Another eats food prepared by an infected hand. The bacterium, often Shigella or E. coli, though unknown at the time, finds a perfect breeding ground in the crowded, often unsanitary conditions of a military encampment. You try to avoid the sick, but in the close quarters of camp life, it's a futile effort. You might be part of a company that, just yesterday, was marching 20 miles a day, full of bravado and purpose. Now, half your comrades are too weak to stand, constantly running to relieve themselves behind the nearest bush, or simply collapsing in their tracks. The once disciplined lines dissolve into scattered groups of suffering men. The smell, initially localized, begins to permeate the entire camp, a putrid, sickening stench of human waste that hangs heavy in the air. A constant reminder of the unseen horror. The commanders, often bewildered by the rapid spread and devastating effects, initially attribute the sickness to bad air or noxious vapors rising from the ground, or perhaps even divine displeasure. They certainly don't link it to the very water their men are drinking, or the food they are eating, or the open pits they are using as latrines. This fundamental misunderstanding of contagion means that the very actions taken to manage the crisis often inadvertently worsen it. One common historical fact is that more soldiers died from disease than from combat wounds in most wars before the 20th century. What is often overlooked, however, is that dysentery was consistently one of the absolute top killers among these diseases, frequently surpassing even typhus or smallpox in its lethality and debilitating effect on army operations. It wasn't merely a cause of death, it was the cause of death for vast numbers of soldiers in countless campaigns. A more obscure detail is the particular terror of a dysentery outbreak during a retreat. Imagine your army, already low on morale and supplies, being chased by the enemy. Now, add scores of men too weak to march, constantly needing to stop, leaving trails of human waste behind them. The sick become a desperate drag on the able-bodied, forced to abandon their comrades or watch them fall prey to the pursuing enemy. The very act of flight becomes agonizingly slow, a nightmare of fear and uncontrollable bodily functions. Historians still debate whether the collapse of certain historical campaigns, particularly those of attrition, was more a result of direct combat losses or the insidious, relentless weakening of forces due to diseases like dysentery. Was Napoleon's disastrous Russian campaign ultimately undone more by the Russian winter and the sheer scale of the conflict, or by the millions of agonizing deaths from typhus and dysentery that decimated his grand army? You might ponder this as you see the historical records speak of armies melting away, not from glorious battles, but from quiet, internal implosions. The immediate impact on military logistics is catastrophic. Supplies of food and water become even more critical, yet their distribution is hampered by sick men and dwindling transport. Medical supplies, already scarce, are overwhelmed by the sheer volume of patients. Every able-bodied man is needed for duty, but now, a significant portion of the force is rendered useless, needing care themselves. The distinction between combatants and non-combatants blurs as healthy soldiers are forced into nursing roles. Further depleting fighting strength, the psychological toll on the soldiers is immense. You see the strong crumble, the brave reduced to helpless, trembling wrecks. Hope dissipates as the disease spreads seemingly unchecked. The sight and smell of so much suffering, combined with your own vulnerability, breeds a pervasive sense of despair. The enemy outside the camp seems almost less terrifying than the enemy within, which can strike anyone, anywhere, with no warning and no effective defense. This wasn't just physical torment, it was a profound assault on morale. Even the simplest acts of soldiering become impossible. Holding a rifle steady, digging a trench, standing guard all require a physical resilience that dysentery utterly destroys. You might see men collapse on duty, their bodies betraying them. The sheer effort of trying to control one's bowels while wearing heavy military gear adds another layer of humiliation and discomfort. The soldier, once a symbol of strength and discipline, is reduced to a frail, vulnerable human being, constantly battling an internal war that he cannot win. This sudden, overwhelming onset of dysentery transforms a disciplined, fighting force into a collection of desperately sick individuals. The battlefield is not just the open field where armies clash, it is the entire camp. Every latrine pit, every water source, every shared meal. And the casualties, while less dramatic than those from cannon fire, are far more numerous, far more widespread, and far more debilitating to the very foundation of military power. The invisible enemy has arrived, and for now, it is winning. You're not just a soldier, you're a patient in a vast, sprawling, and deeply primitive field hospital. The overwhelming reality is that when dysentery strikes, the medical understanding of your era is woefully inadequate, rooted in theories that are, to your modern mind, almost comically incorrect. This leads to early battles, misunderstanding, and miasma, and a slew of ineffective, often harmful, treatments soldiers were forced to endure. Imagine a regimental surgeon, a man of goodwill but limited knowledge. Examining you, he doesn't think of invisible bacteria or contaminated water. Instead, he might nod sagely, concluding that your humors are out of balance, or that you've been exposed to bad air, the pervasive miasma that supposedly rises from swamps, decaying matter, or even too many unwashed bodies. This belief means that instead of focusing on hygiene, efforts might be directed at burning strong-smelling herbs or airing out tents, actions that do little to stop the spread of a fecal oral disease, one of the most common, and perhaps most terrifying. Treatments you might face is bleeding. The surgeon believes that by removing bad blood from your system, he can restore balance and expel the illness. You watch, weak and dizzy, as a vein in your arm is cut, and you're precious, life-giving blood streams into a basin. Sometimes, leeches are applied, their bloated bodies a testament to the blood they've drawn. The irony, of course, is that with dysentery already causing severe dehydration and weakness, bleeding you only hastens your decline, pushing you closer to collapse. Then there's the equally popular practice of purging. Doctors believe that inducing violent vomiting or diarrhea will cleanse the body of the disease. You might be given potent emetics like ipecac, causing you to retch uncontrollably, or harsh laxatives such as calomel mercurous chloride, which produces excruciating bowel movements. This, for a soldier already suffering from uncontrolled diarrhea, is a form of exquisite torture, further dehydrating you and exacerbating your symptoms. The screams and groans of men being purged echo through the makeshift infirmary, a soundtrack to their misery. Food and drink, too, were often misunderstood, instead of encouraging clean water and rehydration. You might be given highly acidic concoctions or strong alcoholic spirits, believed to kill the disease. The concept of rehydration therapy, so fundamental to treating diarrhea today, is entirely absent. Instead, liquids might be withheld, or you might be given thick, indigestible gruel, further stressing your already ravaged digestive system. It's a bitter joke the very efforts to help you out often make you sicker. One common historical understanding is that soldiers died from disease. What is often overlooked, however, is the active harm frequently inflicted by the medical treatments themselves, which were often more detrimental than the disease's natural course. Many soldiers survived the initial infection only to succumb to the cure, weakened beyond recovery by bleeding, purging, and starvation. You might see a man who seemed to be recovering suddenly take a turn for the worse after a particularly aggressive round of treatment. A more obscure detail is the use of opium or laudanum opium dissolved in alcohol as a pain reliever and a means to stop diarrhea, while offering temporary relief from the excruciating cramps and constant urges. It also masks the severity of the dehydration and could lead to constipation, paradoxically prolonging the illness in some cases. You might crave the temporary solace the dark, bitter liquid offers, knowing it's the only respite from the torment. Even as it dulls your senses and adds to your confusion, historians still debate whether the widespread belief in miasma, despite being scientifically inaccurate, inadvertently led to some beneficial outcomes by promoting better ventilation and a general, albeit vague, sense of cleanliness. Did the idea of bad air lead to practices that, by chance, reduce the concentration of airborne pathogens, even if not the specific fecal oral ones causing dysentery? You might ponder this as you see commanders ordering windows opened or fires lit to purify the air. The concept of hygiene as we understand it is largely absent. Surgeons operate with unwashed hands, instruments are rarely sterilized, and dressings are often reused. You might see a surgeon move from one patient, their hands covered in blood and pus, to the next, unknowingly transferring bacteria. The very places meant for healing the field hospitals and infirmaries often became major vectors for disease transmission, creating a horrific cycle of infection and reinfection. Even the most basic comforts are scarce. You might lie on a straw pallet, surrounded by the moans of other sick men. The stench of vomit, diarrhea, and unwashed bodies is pervasive. Clean water for washing is a luxury. The constant presence of flies, drawn to the unsanitary conditions, adds another layer of misery and serves as an unwitting agent of disease transmission. Moving from latrine to food, it's a sensory assault, leaving you feeling utterly dehumanized. The lack of effective pain relief means you endure the agonizing cramps and constant urges with grim stoicism. Sleep is fitful and constantly interrupted by your own body's demands or the suffering of your comrades. You lie there, lucid in your torment, wishing for oblivion. But it rarely comes quickly. The sheer physical endurance required to survive dysentery, even without medical intervention, is immense. The general helplessness of the medical staff, despite their best intentions, is palpable. They are fighting an enemy they cannot see, with tools they do not understand. Their knowledge is based on centuries of flawed theory, passed down through generations of practitioners who, like them, watched helplessly as countless lives were lost. You might see the despair in their eyes, mirroring your own, as they try yet another unproven remedy, knowing it will likely fail. This period in military medicine is a stark reminder of humanity's long, hard struggle against disease. A time when bravery on the battlefield was often overshadowed by the silent. Unseen wars waged within the body, fought with ignorance and antiquated methods. You're living through a medical dark age. And the odds, truly, are stacked against you. You're not just fighting a visible enemy on the battlefield. You're locked in a far deadlier struggle against an invisible foe born from the very conditions of your military life. This is the grim reality of logistics of disease, food, and filth, where contaminated supplies and appalling sanitation practices become the unwitting allies of dysentery, decimating armies from within. Imagine setting up camp after a long march. Thousands of men, horses, and wagons converge on a patch of ground. The first priority is usually security, then perhaps tents. But what about sanitation in this era? It's an afterthought, or handled with a shocking lack of understanding. Latrines are often shallow pits dug haphazardly, or sometimes no pits at all. You witness men simply relieving themselves wherever they stand, or just a short distance from the camp's edge. The ground quickly becomes saturated with human waste, especially after the first few cases of dysentery appear. The proximity of latrines to water sources is a death sentence. A stream that just upstream provided drinking water might downstream be where hundreds of soldiers are washing, or worse, where human waste is flowing. Wells, dug hastily, are easily contaminated by surface runoff or shallow seepage from nearby unsanitary areas. You might drink from a communal bucket, quenching your thirst, entirely unaware that the water, seemingly clear, is teeming with the microscopic agents of your eventual illness. The very fluid meant to sustain you becomes a vehicle for disease. Then there's the food supply. Imagine barrels of salted meat, often poorly cured, sitting for weeks or months, hardtack, dry and brittle. Might be supplemented by foraging, but fresh produce is rare and often unwashed. Food is prepared in open conditions, susceptible to flies that buzz incessantly between piles of waste and the cooking fires. Hands unwashed after latrine visits. Touch bread, ladle stew, and distribute rations. A simple, unwashed apple, passed from soldier to soldier, could carry the seeds of an outbreak. The logistics of feeding thousands of men often overlook the critical element of hygiene. One common historical fact is that armies often suffered heavily from disease. What is often less emphasized, however, is the direct link between specific logistical failures and the scale of dysentery outbreaks. It wasn't just disease in general, it was the precise interplay of inadequate water management, abysmal waste disposal, and contaminated food handling that created perfect storm conditions for epidemic dysentery. You can literally trace the outbreak to the location of the latrines relative to the well. A more obscure detail is the phenomenon of camp fever, or hospital gangrene, which, while not always dysentery itself, was often exacerbated by the same unsanitary conditions. The crowded, filthy environment not only fostered dysentery but also left soldiers vulnerable to a host of other infections, turning minor wounds into fatal ones. It's a reminder that dysentery was often just one symptom of a pervasive, systemic problem of military hygiene. Historians still debate whether the lack of understanding of germ theory was the primary reason for these logistical failures, or if the sheer practical difficulties of managing vast armies in the field, coupled with a prevailing fatalism about disease, made any significant hygienic improvements seem insurmountable. Was it ignorance? Or overwhelming logistical challenges that doomed so many to dysentery? You might ponder this as you observe the overwhelming scale of the encampment. A city of men and waste, spread across the landscape. The sheer numbers exacerbate the problem. A single sick soldier, shedding billions of bacteria, can quickly contaminate an area used by thousands. Without proper disposal, the ground becomes a petri dish. Flies, attracted to the waste, then land on food, on faces, on open wounds, carrying the disease further. It's a silent biological chain reaction, each step multiplying the risk. You see the flies, constant companions in the camp, and now you understand their sinister role. The lack of personal hygiene further compounds the issue. Water is scarce, often prioritized for drinking over washing. Soldiers rarely bathe. Their uniforms are unwashed for weeks or months, and their hands, constantly touching equipment, food, and themselves, become vectors for disease. The concept of hand washing, revolutionary in its simplicity, is completely absent from daily military life. You might try to keep yourself clean, but it's a losing battle against the pervasive filth. Even the dead contributed to the problem. Bodies, whether from combat or disease, might not be buried quickly or deeply enough, contributing to the contamination of the soil and water. Animals, too, could carry the disease. A dead horse, left to rot near a water source, could become another point of infection. The cycle of contamination seemed endless, self-perpetuating, driven by ignorance and the sheer logistical nightmare of managing thousands of men in rudimentary conditions. The very mobility of armies, designed for tactical advantage, inadvertently spread the disease far and wide. A healthy army marches into a contaminated area, picks up the disease, then carries it to the next encampment, leaving a trail of sickness in its wake. There's a morbid efficiency to this spread, turning every tactical movement into a potential epidemiological disaster. You're not just conquering territory, you're conquering disease. And losing, ultimately. The outbreaks of dysentery were not just unfortunate accidents, they were the predictable, tragic consequence of a profound mismatch between the scale of military operations and the rudimentary understanding of sanitation and disease transmission. The unseen enemy, dysentery, was given free rein by the very logistical practices meant to support the army, turning soldiers' own support systems into their greatest vulnerability. You're not just enduring the physical torment of dysentery, you're witnessing its devastating impact on the grand scale of military operations. This is where the unseen enemy proves more formidable than any opposing army, leading to the March of Misery campaigns halted, as dysentery cripples armies, claiming more lives and thwarting more strategic objectives than enemy bullets ever could. Imagine a general poring over maps, planning a brilliant flanking maneuver or a decisive siege. His strategy accounts for enemy numbers, terrain, and supply lines, what he rarely truly accounts for, however, is the insidious collapse from within. Suddenly, reports flood in scores of men too weak to march, hundreds more incapacitated by severe diarrhea. The planned assault falters. The vital supply convoy is delayed because the drivers are too sick to hold the reins. The siege lines thin out, not from enemy fire, but from soldiers collapsing in their own filth. A healthy army can march for days, cover vast distances, and endure harsh conditions. A dysentery-ridden army, however, moves at a snail's pace. If it moves at all, every mile becomes an agonizing ordeal. Men constantly break ranks to relieve themselves, leaving trails of human waste that only further spread the contagion. The rear of the column becomes a slow, shuffling procession of the sick and the dying, a grim testament to the internal breakdown. You see once proud regiments reduced to ragged, exhausted companies, their fighting spirit consumed by the disease. The impact on morale is catastrophic. Soldiers who bravely faced cannon fire now cower at the thought of the next cramp. The enemy is tangible. Dysentery is a phantom, striking indiscriminately, often more terrifying than a visible foe. The knowledge that your comrades are falling around you, not from a noble charge, but from an ignoble internal collapse. Breeds a profound sense of helplessness and despair. Orders become harder to enforce as discipline erodes under the weight of widespread suffering. One common historical fact is that disease historically caused more casualties in armies than combat. What is often overlooked, however, is the strategic paralysis directly caused by diseases like dysentery. It wasn't just about losing men, it was about losing the ability to fight, to maneuver, to execute plans. Armies literally became bogged down by their own bodily fluids. Unable to advance or retreat effectively, you can point to countless historical campaigns where the best-laid plans of generals dissolved into chaos. Not on the battlefield, but in the unsanitary latrine pits of their own camps. A more obscure detail is the particular vulnerability of besieging armies to dysentery. When an army lays siege to a fortified city, they typically settle into static positions for extended periods. This stationary existence, combined with the concentration of thousands of men, inadequate sanitation, and often dwindling fresh water supplies, created ideal conditions for massive dysentery outbreaks. You might hear tales of garrisons cheering as the besieging army, seemingly invincible, suddenly begins to waste away, their lines thinned by sickness rather than valiant defense. Historians still debate whether the strategic decisions made during certain campaigns, particularly prolonged sieges, were fully informed by the likely impact of disease, or if commanders consistently underestimated the epidemiological threat posed by dysentery. Did generals truly grasp that their army could be effectively destroyed from within? Or did they continue to prioritize combat strength over the unseen enemy of hygiene? You might wonder if their tactical brilliance was blinded by a lack of understanding about disease. The logistics of supplying a dysentery-ridden army become a nightmarish challenge. Food supplies are depleted quickly as more men require special diets if available, and those responsible for transport fall ill. Water, already a critical resource, becomes even more precious as men desperately seek to rehydrate. The demand for medical supplies, however meager, skyrockets, overwhelming already strained systems. Every aspect of military operations grinds to a slow, agonizing halt. Think of Napoleon's campaign in Russia in 1812. While the brutal Russian winter and strategic defeats played a major role, millions of soldiers from his Grand Army perished from diseases like typhus and dysentery long before they ever reached Moscow or froze on the retreat. You picture vast columns of men, not dying heroically in battle, but collapsing by the roadside, their bodies racked by uncontrollable spasms. A grim tableau of an army defeated by its own internal vulnerabilities. The very concept of a fighting fit army becomes a distant memory. A unit might be theoretically at full strength, but if half its men are too weak to lift a musket, constantly needing to relieve themselves, and suffering from debilitating cramps, their effective combat strength is a fraction of their paper numbers. Commanders are forced to make impossible choices, push sick men to their deaths, or abandon strategic objectives, even if an army managed to survive an outbreak and push on. The long-term effects were devastating. Survivors were often left weakened, susceptible to other illnesses, and with a diminished capacity for sustained effort. You might see men who recovered outwardly, but whose faces carried the permanent etchings of their ordeal, a reminder of the internal war they fought and the toll it took. The ghost of dysentery would linger in their ranks for weeks, even months, a constant drain on their energy and effectiveness. Dysentery was not merely a tragic footnote in military history. It was a strategic weapon, albeit one wielded by nature itself. It shaped the outcome of wars, decided the fate of empires, and laid low more armies than the most brilliant enemy generals. You see now that the true genius of command, in those historical contexts, might not have been in battlefield tactics, but in the elusive, often ignored, mastery of sanitation and disease prevention. You're not just observing the statistics of war. You're feeling the acute, soul-crushing despair of a soldier caught in the grip of dysentery. This is the soldier's plight despair in the ranks. A relentless physical and psychological torment that breaks even the strongest wills and leaves an indelible mark on those who survive. Imagine yourself waking in the pre-dawn chill, your gut twisting with a familiar, agonizing cramp. You leap from your meager bedding, scrambling in the darkness, desperate to find a secluded spot before your bowels betray you. The constant, gnawing pain in your abdomen makes it impossible to find comfort, whether lying down, sitting, or standing. Your stomach churns, a violent, unpredictable beast within you. This isn't just discomfort, it's a profound, invasive misery that consumes your every waking thought and steals your sleep. The physical exhaustion is overwhelming. Each bout of diarrhea drains you, leaving you weaker, more listless. You constantly feel thirsty, your mouth dry and pasty. But drinking too much water often seems to trigger another agonizing expulsion. Your muscles ache from dehydration, your head pounds, and a persistent fever leaves you alternately shivering and sweating. You lose weight rapidly, your uniform hanging loosely on your once sturdy frame. The very act of standing, of lifting your rifle, becomes an immense effort. You feel your strength, your very life force, draining away with each watery discharge. Beyond the physical, the psychological toll is immense. You are surrounded by the sick and the dying, hearing their groans, smelling their waste, watching their rapid decline. This constant exposure to suffering chips away at your morale, breeds a chilling fatalism. You see brave men, who never flinched under enemy fire, reduced to helpless, trembling wrecks by this insidious disease. The knowledge that you too could swiftly become one of them, without warning or effective remedy, hangs like a dark cloud over your very existence. One common historical fact is that soldiers were tough and resilient. What is often overlooked, however, is how dysentery systematically stripped away that resilience, turning hardened fighters into hollowed-out shells. It wasn't a quick, glorious death. It was a slow, humiliating, and utterly undignified deterioration that robbed men of their pride and their will to fight. You can see it in their eyes, a vacant, haunted look that speaks of profound suffering. A more obscure detail is the particular psychological trauma of the loss of bodily control. For a soldier, discipline and control are paramount. Dysentery, with its unpredictable and often explosive urges, strips that control away completely. The humiliation of soiling oneself, or having to desperately relieve oneself in front of comrades, added another layer of psychological torment to the physical pain. You might try to maintain a semblance of dignity, but your body betrays you repeatedly, leaving you feeling utterly exposed and degraded. Historians still debate the full extent of battle fatigue or shell shock versus disease-induced psychological trauma in various wars. Was the widespread despair and breakdown of morale purely a result of combat stress, or did the relentless, debilitating nature of diseases like dysentery, combined with the grotesque conditions, contribute more significantly to the mental collapse of soldiers? You might wonder how many men who broke in battle were already half broken by days of internal agony. The camaraderie among soldiers, often a lifeline in wartime, is tested to its limits. While some comrades might offer what little help they can, others, out of fear of contagion or sheer exhaustion, might distance themselves. You might feel isolated, even amidst thousands of men. As your personal misery consumes your world, the shared suffering doesn't always breed unity. Sometimes it breeds a desperate self-preservation. The sheer unpredictability of dysentery is another source of despair. It could strike anyone, at any time, regardless of their rank or strength. You might see the healthiest, most robust men suddenly succumb, while others, seemingly weaker, manage to resist. This random nature fosters a sense of injustice, a feeling that fate is playing a cruel, arbitrary game with your life. There's no clear enemy to fight, no battle strategy to employ, just a silent, unseen threat that leaves you constantly on edge. Sleep, when it comes, is rarely restful. Night sweats leave you drenched, and the constant urge to relieve yourself means frequent, miserable trips into the cold. dark night. You dream of clean water, of solid food, of a moment without pain. But those dreams are fleeting, shattered by the next cramp, the next desperate rush. Your body is screaming, and there is no escape. Even in slumber, for those who survive. The experience leaves deep scars. Many are left with chronic digestive issues, a permanent reminder of their ordeal, but perhaps more profoundly, they carry the memory of the sheer helplessness, the loss of dignity, and the pervasive despair. You carry the ghost of that misery within you, long after the physical symptoms have abated, a grim lesson in the true horrors of war. This wasn't the glory of combat. It was the raw, brutal reality of human suffering on an unimaginable scale. You're deep in the era of overwhelming illness, where armies are decimated by unseen enemies, and traditional medical wisdom offers little more than superstition and harm. Yet, amidst this despair, a few visionary individuals, driven by observation and relentless curiosity, begin to challenge the status quo. This is the period of medical pioneers' observation and reform, as brave minds slowly but surely connect hygiene with health. Initiating a revolution in military medicine, imagine a keen-eyed surgeon, perhaps one who has served through multiple campaigns, growing increasingly frustrated by the endless stream of dying soldiers. He notices patterns: the men drinking from that particular well always seem to get sick, or the ward where beds are cleaned regularly has fewer fatalities. These are not scientific experiments as you know them, but crucial, empirical observations, the seeds of a new understanding. This early, almost intuitive. Grasp of epidemiology marks the very beginning of the long road toward effective military hygiene. One of the most pivotal figures, though his work was initially met with skepticism, was Florence Nightingale during the Crimean War, 1853-1856. You might picture her, lamp in hand, moving through the wretched, overcrowded military hospitals in Scutari. She wasn't a microbiologist, but she was a meticulous statistician and an unwavering advocate for sanitation. Her raw data revealed a shocking truth. Far more soldiers were dying from preventable diseases like dysentery, typhus, and cholera than from battle wounds. She insisted on clean bedding, fresh air, proper waste disposal, and clean water. Her reforms, though simple, dramatically reduced the death rate in her hospitals. Her impact was profound because she didn't just feel things were wrong, she proved it with numbers. Before Nightingale, the idea that cleanliness itself could save lives was not widely accepted, especially in the chaos of military campaigns. You see the resistance she faced from entrenched military bureaucracy, but her undeniable results spoke louder than any traditional prejudice. She was literally cleaning up death, one ward at a time. One common historical fact is that Florence Nightingale greatly improved nursing. What is often overlooked, however, is that her most significant contribution to military medicine was not just compassionate care, but her pioneering use of statistics and her relentless focus on sanitation and public health infrastructure within the Army. She wasn't just a lady with a lamp. She was a data-driven reformer who showed that disease was a logistical and preventable problem, not merely an act of God or fate. A more obscure detail is the work of other, lesser-known military medical officers who, inspired by similar observations, quietly implemented local reforms. For example, some regimental surgeons might have insisted on boiling water for their specific units, or digging deeper. More isolated latrines, achieving localized successes that weren't widely publicized, but contributed to a growing body of evidence. You might hear whispers of a certain lucky regiment that seemed to avoid the worst outbreaks. Their good fortune often attributed to the simple, common-sense practices of their pragmatic surgeon. Historians still debate whether the reforms initiated by figures like Nightingale were truly revolutionary in their conception. or if they were merely the logical application of common sense that had been ignored due to military inertia and a prevailing lack of germ theory understanding. Did they invent new principles, or simply force the military establishment to adopt practices that should have been obvious all along? You might consider how often the most profound changes come not from radical new ideas, but from the disciplined application of simple truths. The concept of ventilation became increasingly important as the miasma theory slowly gave way to early inklings of airborne transmission. Military hospitals and barracks began to be designed or adapted with more windows and better airflow. You might feel a distinct difference in the air quality between an old, stuffy barrack and a newly built or renovated military hospital. A subtle but significant change driven by these nascent understandings of health. The importance of clean water also started to gain traction. Engineers and medical officers began to collaborate on strategies for securing and purifying water supplies for armies in the field, while large-scale water treatment was still far off. Basic methods like boiling water or sourcing from upstream locations became more deliberate practices, albeit not universally applied. You see rudimentary attempts at filtration or the careful selection of encampment sites based on water purity, a small but vital step towards mitigating dysentery. The very idea of a medical corps dedicated not just to treating the wounded, but to preventing disease began to take shape. These nascent organizations started to compile data, issue regulations on camp hygiene, and train personnel in rudimentary sanitation practices. It's a slow, bureaucratic shift, but it signifies a fundamental recognition by military leadership that disease prevention was as critical to victory as firepower. Even something as basic as personal hygiene among soldiers slowly started to be emphasized, though consistency remained a challenge. Commanders, seeing the debilitating effects of disease, might issue orders for daily washing if water was available or for cleaner uniforms. You might grumble about the extra effort, but in the back of your mind, the stark contrast between the healthy and the sick becomes a powerful motivator. These pioneering efforts, born from observation, data, and sheer will, began to chip away at the overwhelming power of diseases like dysentery. They laid the groundwork for the later, scientifically informed reforms that would truly transform military health. You are witnessing the moment when armies began to fight not just their visible enemies, but also the invisible ones. By truly understanding the silent, deadly link between filth and fate, you're deep in the heart of a military encampment, a temporary city erected for thousands of men. And the grim reality hits you. The very design and habits of camp life are a perfectly engineered system for the rapid spread of dysentery. It's a tragic paradox where the actions of daily living inadvertently create a relentless cycle of contamination. Imagine the layout of a typical camp. Tents are pitched close together, often in neat rows for military order. But this proximity means thousands of bodies breathing the same air, existing in close quarters. Personal space is a forgotten luxury when one soldier falls ill. Sharing a tent with several others, the likelihood of direct or indirect transmission skyrockets. You might see a man struggling with dysentery, barely able to reach the communal latrine, and his tent mates are already living in a contaminated environment. The latrines themselves are a central point of this contamination cycle. Often, they are mere shallow trenches or open pits. Hastily dug and rarely covered, the sheer volume of human waste produced by thousands of men, especially when an outbreak hits, quickly overwhelms these primitive facilities. You smell the pervasive stench, a mixture of putrefaction and human excrement, hanging heavy in the air, particularly on warm days. Flies, attracted to the waste, swarm incessantly, buzzing from the latrine pits to the cooking areas, to the faces of sleeping soldiers, carrying disease-laden particles on their tiny legs. Then consider the water supply. Armies often camped near rivers or streams, their primary source of water. But in the absence of germ theory, the concept of upstream for drinking and downstream for washing and waste disposal was often not strictly enforced, if understood at all. You might see men drawing water for cooking and drinking from the same stream just yards away from where others are washing clothes. or where human waste is flowing into the current. A single contaminated upstream source could infect an entire army, turning life-giving water into a deadly poison. One common historical understanding is that armies in the field suffered from poor hygiene. What is often less highlighted is how the practical constraints and ingrained habits of military life actively facilitated the transmission of dysentery. It wasn't just a lack of knowledge. It was the systemic challenges of scale, mobility, and the prevailing make-do attitude that inadvertently created epidemiological nightmares. The necessity of rapid setup and breakdown often prioritized speed over sanitation. A more obscure detail is the role of communal eating utensils and drinking vessels in many armies. Personal canteens and mess kits were less common, or hygiene for them was neglected. Soldiers might share cups, ladle stew from a communal pot with unwashed hands, or simply eat directly from a shared platter. This direct contact provided another efficient pathway for the dysentery bacterium to jump from an infected individual to healthy comrades. You might recall sharing a canteen with a friend, never once thinking about the invisible enemy lurking on the rim. Historians still debate whether the discipline and hierarchical nature of armies, designed for combat efficiency, inadvertently hindered effective sanitation by making it difficult for lower-ranking soldiers to challenge unhygienic practices or for commanders to prioritize sanitation over tactical objectives. Did the very structure meant to ensure order sometimes perpetuate chaos in public health? You might ponder how often the best intentions can go awry due to ingrained systems. The disposal of dead bodies, whether from combat or disease, also contributed to the cycle of contamination, if not buried quickly and deeply enough. Human and animal corpses could leach pathogens into the soil and groundwater, further contaminating the very environment the living relied upon. You might see the grim side of burial details struggling to keep up with the mounting casualties, their efforts often insufficient to prevent further spread. Personal hygiene was almost non-existent. Water was too precious for regular bathing, and soap was a luxury. Soldiers wore the same uniforms for weeks or months, accumulating filth and sweat. Hands, the primary vectors for fecal oral diseases, were rarely washed, especially before handling food. You might try your best to keep clean, but in a camp where thousands live in close proximity, surrounded by their own waste, it's a losing battle. The pervasive body odor, mixed with the stench of decay and excrement, becomes the constant backdrop to your existence. The mobility of an army, essential for strategic advantage, ironically served as a super spreader event for dysentery. A contaminated army would march from one location to another, leaving a trail of infection in its wake and picking up new strains from contaminated ground. Each new encampment became a fresh opportunity for the disease to flourish and spread further afield. Turning military maneuvers into epidemiological tours, you might move from a relatively healthy area to one ravaged by sickness, unknowingly carrying the seeds of disaster with you. This self-perpetuating cycle of contamination, driven by logistical constraints, ignorance of germ theory, and the sheer scale of human interaction, made dysentery an almost inevitable companion to armies throughout history. It was a silent, relentless enemy that thrived in the very heart of the military machine. A chilling testament to how easily life-sustaining practices could become deadly. You're deep in the brutal crucible of war, facing an enemy that strikes from within. Yet, even in the darkest hours, necessity truly becomes the mother of invention. This is the era of innovation under fire-tentative solutions, where desperate attempts to manage and mitigate dysentery outbreaks lead to early, often rudimentary, but crucial advancements in military health. Imagine the frustration of a resourceful quartermaster, watching his supply lines crumble, or a dedicated surgeon, seeing his hospital tents overflowing with the sick. They can't wait for scientific breakthroughs that are decades away. Instead, they must act with the knowledge they possess, trying whatever works. Even if the why remains a mystery, this trial and error approach, born of immediate crisis, sparks the first tentative steps towards disease control. One of the most immediate and impactful innovations was the forced improvement of latrine management. Commanders, seeing their armies crippled, began to insist on stricter rules for human waste disposal. You might see specific orders issued: latrines must be dug deeper, further away from water sources and cooking areas, and perhaps covered with earth regularly, while often inconsistently enforced. These directives, born of painful experience, represented a fundamental shift from outright neglect to a rudimentary form of waste management. The simple act of digging a deeper hole could save hundreds of lives. The concept of boiling water, while not universally understood as killing germs, was sometimes implemented out of a vague sense that heat purified liquids. You might encounter officers ordering water for their units to be boiled, especially when camping near suspect sources. This wasn't driven by germ theory, but by observation units that boiled their water seemed to suffer less. It was a pragmatic solution, stumbled upon through trial and error, offering a vital, if accidental, defense against waterborne pathogens. One common historical fact is that military medicine was quite primitive. What is often overlooked, however, is the ingenuity and practical problem-solving that occurred at the ground level in response to devastating disease outbreaks. While grand scientific theories were lacking, resourceful individuals in the field often developed effective, if unscientific, methods of mitigation that saved lives, laying the groundwork for later, more systematic reforms. A more obscure detail is the use of vinegar or dilute acids to purify water or food, or to clean surfaces, based on ancient beliefs about acids being cleansing agents. Soldiers might add a splash of vinegar to their drinking water, or use it to wipe down their mess kits. While not truly sterilizing, it could sometimes inhibit the growth of certain bacteria or make water less palatable to some pathogens. Offering a small, often psychological, benefit. You might remember the sharp, acidic tang in your mouth, hoping it was doing some good. Historians still debate whether the most effective early interventions against dysentery were top-down military regulations or bottom-up adaptations and innovations by individual units and medical staff on the ground. Did the official orders bring about change? Or were the practical solutions discovered in the chaos of the field more significant in the short term? You might reflect on how often true progress comes from unexpected places. The development of more organized medical services also began to take shape. Instead of individual regimental surgeons operating in isolation, rudimentary medical corps started to coordinate efforts, share information, and establish more centralized field hospitals. This allowed for better, albeit still limited, allocation of resources and a more consistent approach to managing the sick. You might see a dedicated medical tent, however basic, specifically for dysentery patients. A small step towards organized care, even camp location selection started to become more sophisticated. Commanders, having learned bitter lessons, might begin to avoid camping near known swamps, stagnant water, or previously contaminated sites. While their understanding of miasma was flawed, their practical avoidance of disease hotspots could inadvertently reduce exposure to actual pathogens. You see the subtle shift in decision-making, where epidemiological concerns, however vaguely understood, begin to influence tactical choices. The simple act of improving soldier nutrition, even marginally, sometimes had an impact. Commanders might prioritize fresh rations or try to vary diets when possible, recognizing that malnourished men were more susceptible to illness, while full nutritional science was far off. The intuitive link between strength and food began to influence supply efforts. You might feel a slight surge of hope when fresh vegetables or a piece of fruit somehow makes it into your meager rations. The growing understanding of contagion, even before the specific identification of microbes, also led to tentative isolation practices. Sick soldiers might be moved to separate tents or areas, or their personal effects might be kept apart, while often imperfect and difficult to enforce in crowded camps. These early attempts at quarantine, driven by a growing fear of spread, represented a nascent understanding of disease control. You might be told to avoid a certain area of the camp, a whispered warning about the sickness there. These innovations, born from the crucible of necessity, were not always perfect, nor were they universally applied, but they marked a crucial turning point. They showed that dysentery was not an unstoppable force of nature, but a problem that could, to some extent, be managed through deliberate action and practical improvements in hygiene and logistics. You are witnessing the army slowly, painfully, learning to fight an enemy it couldn't see. One lesson at a time. You've witnessed the immediate horrors of dysentery on the battlefield, how it crippled armies and broke soldiers. But the story doesn't end when the guns fall silent or the sick recover. For countless individuals and for military doctrine itself, there's a beyond-the-battlefield long-term impact, leaving lasting effects on survivors and profoundly shaping how armies would approach health in future conflicts. Imagine a soldier, years after the campaign, back in civilian life. He survived the bullet and the bayonet, but the lingering ghost of dysentery remains. His digestive system is never quite the same. He suffers from chronic stomach pains, unpredictable bouts of diarrhea, and a sensitivity to certain foods. He might be weaker, more susceptible to other illnesses. His once robust constitution permanently undermined by the ravages of the disease. You see the haunted look in his eyes, a subtle reminder of the internal war he fought long after the external one ended. The psychological scars run deep, too. The memory of the pervasive stench, the endless groans of the sick, the humiliation of losing bodily control, and the constant fear of contagion leave an indelible mark. Many survivors suffered from what you might recognize as a form of post-traumatic stress. Though it was not named or understood in their time, they might have nightmares, an aversion to certain smells or foods, or a general wariness about sanitation that seems obsessive to those who didn't share their experience. You might encounter an old veteran who meticulously boils all his drinking water, a habit ingrained by the horrors of the past. For the military as an institution, the lessons of dysentery were hard-won and brutally expensive. The sheer number of casualties due to disease, often far outstripping combat losses, forced a re-evaluation of military priorities. Generals and strategists began to understand that a healthy army was a formidable army, and that disease prevention was as critical as weaponry or tactics. This shift wasn't immediate, but the scale of the suffering demanded attention. One common historical fact is that medical science advanced significantly after major wars. What is often overlooked, however, is how the sheer logistical and human cost of dysentery directly fueled the demand for these advancements within the military, accelerating research into sanitation, germ theory, and later, vaccinations. The need was so great, the failure so catastrophic, that it compelled institutions to invest in scientific inquiry and practical reforms. A more obscure detail is the development of specific military hygiene manuals and regulations that became increasingly sophisticated over time. Early versions might have been simple directives about latrine digging. Later ones detailed proper water sourcing, food inspection, and personal cleanliness. These documents, dry and bureaucratic as they might seem, were direct responses to the devastating lessons of dysentery, reflecting a conscious effort to codify and institutionalize healthier practices. You might see a dusty old manual, filled with surprisingly detailed, if still evolving, advice on camp sanitation. Historians still debate whether the long-term changes in military hygiene were primarily driven by enlightened medical leadership, or by the pragmatic demands of reducing casualty rates and maintaining effective fighting forces in an increasingly complex world. Was it humanitarian concern or military necessity that ultimately propelled armies towards better health practices? You might ponder how often progress is a blend of both. The experience with dysentery also contributed to the growing emphasis on medical statistics within armies. The ability to track disease rates, identify hotspots, and measure the impact of interventions became crucial. This data-driven approach, pioneered by figures like Florence Nightingale, remember her from Part 6, the lady with the lamp, who was also a brilliant statistician, allowed military medical departments to argue more effectively for resources and implement evidence-based policies. You see the creation of detailed medical records, tabulating illnesses and deaths, painting a stark statistical picture of the disease's toll. The impact on recruitment and public perception was also significant. Stories of rampant disease and horrific camp conditions spread, making it harder to attract volunteers. Governments had a vested interest in portraying military service as less perilous from a health perspective. This pressure also fueled the drive for better medical care and preventative measures. As a healthier army was also a more appealing one for the medical profession itself. The constant struggle with dysentery in military settings provided a vast, if tragic, laboratory. The sheer volume of cases allowed for observation and experimentation, and the gradual refinement of understanding about infectious diseases. Many doctors gained invaluable experience managing outbreaks, insights that would later contribute to civilian public health. You see how the horrors of war, ironically, sometimes accelerated medical knowledge. The specter of dysentery continued to influence military planning for centuries, even as new threats emerged. The lessons of sanitation, clean water, and waste management remained fundamental to preventing mass casualties from intestinal diseases. The modern military, with its advanced field hospitals, water purification systems, and strict hygiene protocols, stands as a direct descendant of the painful, bloody lessons learned in the dysentery-ridden camps of the past. You understand that the sacrifices of those who suffered from this awful disease were not entirely in vain. Their misery helped pave the way for a healthier future for soldiers to come. You've traversed the long, brutal history of dysentery's impact on armies, from its devastating outbreaks to the desperate, often misguided, attempts to combat it. Now, you stand at a pivotal point where scientific understanding finally begins to catch up with the sheer scale of the problem. This is the era of a slow retreat lessons learned, as persistent reforms, driven by hard-won knowledge, finally begin to conquer this invisible foe. Imagine the dawn of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The work of pioneers like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch, remember him from the tuberculosis story. The same meticulous methods applied here has firmly established germ theory. The invisible enemy is no longer a mystery. It's a specific bacterium or protozoan that can be identified, tracked, and, crucially, understood in its transmission. This fundamental shift in knowledge is the single greatest weapon against dysentery. You feel a profound sense of relief, knowing that the why of the sickness is finally clear. With germ theory, the solutions, while still challenging to implement on a large scale, become clear. The focus shifts aggressively to sanitation and hygiene. Armies begin to establish strict protocols for latrine construction and maintenance, ensuring they are dug far from water sources, covered regularly, and properly disinfected. You see dedicated sanitation details, no longer an afterthought but a critical component of military operations. Tasked solely with managing waste, the purity of water becomes paramount. Military engineers and medical officers collaborate to develop and implement methods for water purification in the field, while complex filtration systems or large-scale chlorination are still developing. Basic practices like boiling water for consumption become standard operating procedure, not just for individual units, but for entire armies. You might even see the advent of rudimentary water filters or the use of chemicals like iodine or chlorine in later periods to make water safe to drink. This is a deliberate, scientific approach to safeguarding the most vital resource. One common historical fact is that advances in medicine and sanitation dramatically reduced disease in 20th century warfare. What is often less emphasized, however, is the cumulative effect of decades of incremental, often unglamorous, reforms in basic hygiene that laid the groundwork for these later, more dramatic medical breakthroughs. It wasn't just a single invention, it was the persistent, systematic application of learned lessons about clean water, waste, and food handling. A more obscure detail is the development of specific military-issue field hygiene kits for individual soldiers. These might include items like personal soap, small water purification tablets, or instructions for proper hand washing. This move reflected a recognition that personal habits, when multiplied by thousands, could have a profound impact on the overall health of the force. You might grudgingly carry your small kit, remembering the horrors of the past and the importance of its contents. Historians still debate whether the institutional changes in military hygiene were primarily driven by a top-down mandate from high command, or by the persistent advocacy and demonstrated success of military medical professionals who had seen firsthand the devastating cost of neglect. Did the generals finally listen to the doctors? Or did the doctors finally gain enough authority to implement their findings? You might consider how often change is a push and pull between different priorities. Food preparation and handling also saw significant reforms. Military commissaries and quartermasters implemented stricter guidelines for food storage. Inspection and cooking. The understanding of cross-contamination led to better separation of raw and cooked foods, and more emphasis on proper cooking temperatures. You might notice the inspection of kitchens becoming a regular, serious affair. Overseen by dedicated hygiene officers, the education of soldiers became a critical tool, instead of simply issuing orders. Military training began to include basic lessons on hygiene, emphasizing the importance of hand washing, using latrines, and purifying water. You, as a new recruit, would be drilled on these practices, understanding that your own health and the health of your comrades depended on your adherence to these rules. This widespread dissemination of knowledge empowered individual soldiers to be part of the solution. The development of vaccines and, eventually, antibiotics for bacterial infections in the 20th century further cemented dysentery's retreat as a mass killer in well-supplied armies, while antibiotics like streptomycin wouldn't emerge until the mid-20th century. The relentless research into bacteriology, spurred by the visible need of centuries of warfare, ultimately yielded these powerful cures. You see the true culmination of all the previous struggles. A medical triumph finally offering a definitive treatment. The lingering shadow of dysentery today reminds us that while it's largely controlled in modern, developed armies, it remains a significant threat in conflict zones with poor infrastructure, or during humanitarian crises. The lessons learned over centuries, often through immense suffering, are still vitally relevant. You understand that the fight against such diseases is never truly over, but the knowledge and tools gained through those brutal historical experiences mean that armies now face them with far greater preparation and a profound understanding of their invisible enemy. The campfires of history are fading now. The sounds of suffering replaced by the quiet hum of the night, the memory of muddy boots, the stench of sickness and the relentless, cramping agony begins to recede. Take a moment, a slow, gentle breath, and appreciate the comfort of your surroundings. The clean air filling your lungs without effort or fear. The vast, unseen battle that once claimed so many lives is now largely understood. A testament to the quiet heroes of science and sanitation who, brick by painstaking brick, built a healthier world. Let the images of their struggle and the long, slow retreat of the disease gently guide you into a peaceful slumber,